find the things that you already really love and care about, and just find the connections between those things and the climate or eco-justice, because those connections do exist. It's really just a matter of figuring out what they are. That was what we were doing with ecology. So what's the thing that you love or care about the most? Or what are the few things that you spend your time on? Even if it's stray dogs, right? It doesn't matter. Quilting, it doesn't matter what it is. Whatever it is, there are connections. And if you can integrate that and piggyback it onto what you're already invested in, then it's going to feel very liberating and life-giving to you, and not feel like a chore or a grind or some one more thing to add on to your life.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. All right, welcome to another episode of, both the Poetry of Predicament podcast, and also, as is so often the case these days, an episode of Take My Hand, Conscious Parenting in a Time of Stolen Dreams. And today's guest is someone fully capable of speaking in either of those podcasts. So I'm hoping that maybe we can get her back for what will then be a more Poetry of Predicament, having a larger perspective, a more general perspective on our times in Poetry of Predicament. But today's is a bit more focused on the Take My Hand or the conscious parenting side of the house. And so I'm very pleased to be welcoming Dr. Tallessyn Zawn Grenfell-Lee. And Dr. Grenfell-Lee, I actually don't know how many of the hyphenated names I should include officially, but I'm sure you'll—
You got it right.
In just a moment. Okay, good. You are, in fact, Tallessyn, a ecological ethicist, and you are in the process of doing climate coaching and chaplaincy with people in your community. And in fact, you are a mother of two daughters, 14 and 17. And we've had the opportunity to speak briefly before today's interview, and it just sounds like you're remarkably well suited. You've suited yourself and your family to this conversation very, very well, perhaps more so than most people I have the opportunity to interview. And I'm wondering if you could just fill in any gaps. I've given such a very small amount of information in this brief interview, and in this brief introduction. I'm wondering if you could fill in anything else you'd like me and the viewers to know about you and this household full of fairly conscious people, it sounds like to me. And to perhaps start us on the direction of what is an ecological ethicist, and how have you brought yourself to the parallel path of doing chaplaincy, perhaps with that emphasis as well. So welcome here, and
Thank you.
Start us down this path, won't you?
You know, I'm going to start in the middle and then back up.
Okay.
When I started my doctoral program, which is in ecological ethics, I also helped to found a student-led organization, mostly doctoral students, but a mix of master's and doctoral students there at the Boston University School of Theology, called Ecology. And Ecology was really about showing the connections that already exist between theology and ecological healing and justice. So we had a lot of fun. And one of the things that we were trying to do was respond to the question we all kind of had, which was, why do we have this small group of people working so hard on this issue that is so important? Shouldn't everybody be concerned and be working on this sort of all the time? And so we tried to get some feedback from our colleagues. And one of the main things people were saying was, I just don't feel qualified to talk about this. There was a sense of, I'm going to let other people do this because I'm afraid to do it wrong.
Right.
So I do feel really grateful that I have a background in molecular biology. That was my undergraduate work and some graduate work that I did, which really stood me in good stead when I moved into ecological ethics. I left the field of biology because I realized I wanted to study something a little bit different. I went to seminary, not sure exactly what I wanted to focus on. And while I was there, I realized that I really wanted to focus on ethics, which is the field of oughts. What ought we to do? And it is really satisfying when you're used to having debates going on all around you, and it just seems like everybody has opinions about right and wrong and what ought we to do or ought not to do. And when you study ethics, you realize that people are speaking without knowing it within ethical frameworks. And so to be able to put all of those conversations within ethical frameworks is just very deeply satisfying for me, because all of them have value. You know, people's opinions are different and valuable. So I focused on ethics in my master's of divinity, and then I went back for my doctorate in ethics, and I focused on ecological ethics. That was the area that I was the most interested in because of our time, and it's been a long-standing interest of mine for a long time. And so really it's draws together branches from a lot of different places. You know, you can imagine when you're studying ethics, you kind of have to be aware of psychology and sociology and philosophy and science. There's just like a lot of strands that it pulls together to try to understand how to apply ethical analyses to a given situation. Anyway, so I really enjoy that, partly because of my diverse background.
Yeah.
I had my first daughter. I was pregnant with her when I started my master's in divinity. And so she was really a part of that whole journey. And then I had my second daughter right before I started my doctoral work. And I brought them with me all the time to the school, and everybody there knew them and loved them and welcomed them in, and still do. So really my parenting, as you can imagine, ethics is so deeply involved in parenting, and it's so deeply involved in ecological parenting that really, you know, it's kind of like having case studies all the time.
Right.
So.
Well, I'm curious, as I often do in these conversations, I'm so curious if you might give us a brief contrast between what your perception was as you were growing up, how being an adult in the world and what we could look forward to, what we could dream ourselves and our lives into, and also what impressions you had as what it meant to be also a parent as you were a young person growing up, and really looking into the time when you would be that adult and you would be that parent. Could you describe a little bit about what were some of the impressions that you had then of this is what it was to be an adult in the time when you were growing up, and this is what it would start to look like and feel like as you became a parent yourself?
Yeah, sure. I think my childhood was a little bit unusual in a few ways. For the firsthand, I had three parents. I had my mother and my father and my stepmother. And each of them really contributed to the shaping of my outlook on life, of what it means to be a child, an adult, and a parent in important ways. My mother had a really deep love of the natural world, and she gave that to me, as did my father and stepmother. But my father started to suggest topics for me when I had to write a paper. Starting in junior high, I started to write these papers, and he would go to these National Geographics and say, look at this article about fossil fuels, right? This is in the 80s, you know. Look at this article about the Bengal tiger, which is going extinct, you know, habitat loss. And
wow.
So I started writing these research papers starting in junior high about these issues. And I was very compelled by them, partly because I had been brought up by all three of my parents with a deep, deep love of the creation and a sense of our responsibility to it. And my stepmother was really the first ecofeminist I'd ever met. And she was one of those people driving to redemption centers with recycling before they had curbside recycling. You know, this was my stepmother, just really on the forefront in that way. So I feel very grateful for the awareness that I had from a very young age of the importance of these issues in terms of what it means to be a citizen of the earth, what it means to be a good person. What it means to be a kid is that you care about these things and you take responsibility for your impact too. And what it means is that you have a vision. I was brought up with this idea that we're meant to make a difference, not as individuals, but we're meant to try to be in ministry in some way. Our lives are a covenantal ministry with the earth and with the divine. So it was really like, what is your calling? What are you called to do? Where are you called to go into the world? And that was pretty wide open. It wasn't like I felt hemmed in by parental expectations. It was the opposite. It was more just, you know, wide open. And there was no sense of it has to be some kind of justice-oriented thing, because really there's a sense that I remember my dad saying he loved that I went into science because science was the handwriting of God. That was the term he used. So anyway, my father and stepmother were both Methodist pastors, as were many generations of people before them in my family. And so anyway, to be honest, I know that that has changed with this concept of collapse awareness. It's just that in my family, it didn't really feel like a huge shift, because there was already a sense that there are big, important problems and challenges in the world, and that we're called to look at them and work on them. Racism and sexism and the destruction of the natural world. And it just was always a part of it, but it got kind of increased the pace, you know, and it just sped up and got much more of a crisis mode in the past several decades than it was when I was a kid. So really, that is a difference. And at one point, I sat my children down and I just said, I don't want to be the parent who didn't tell you that it is possible that this is going to go very badly. I'm not going to dwell in that space because I don't believe in dwelling in fear. I just don't want, if something does happen, I don't want you to feel betrayed that I never told you this was possible. But that was one conversation, and we've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of conversations, and that we only need to have that one once.
That's extraordinary. You may well be the first person that's had that almost paved path specifically suited to these times. It's really an extraordinary story. You mentioned one term back in the early part of what you were just sharing, ecofeminism, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what that is.
You know, I'm not sure my stepmother would have used that term. I'm not sure it existed back in the 80s. Looking back now, I can see that's what it was, but she was a feminist and she was an environmentalist. And then this idea of ecofeminism evolved, that when they sort of realized that oppression is all connected. So whenever you see destruction of natural world, then women are paying the price more than anyone other than the natural world itself. Women are hit the hardest. And when you see women, situations where women are more oppressed, it also tends to involve people of color being more oppressed. And there's just all these interconnections among forms of oppression and destruction and dehumanization or objectification. And so ecofeminism just is that recognition of the connections of justice and injustice,
Yeah.
and that we are all working together on these issues at the same time, that intersectional awareness.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, if I could, I'd like to just bridge back to from that extraordinary layout that you just gave us of your growing up and those influences. And now you're in the position you're in, and it's quite a consciously created position. And you've, in the words of my very good friend from a number of years back, you've gotten a lot of that onto your children. And I mean that in the best possible way. You know, we get it on us, you know, from being around one another. And I'm curious if you could just share with us, when you look out into the world, as you scan the various concerns that we might have, different people having different focus, some very, very local and intimate, and some very global, and others doing their best to not be aware of it at all. I'm curious, what are the most pressing of those concerns when you look out, just talking about today? I know that there's at least for myself, it's a changing list, depending on the priorities in my own seeing and experiencing in a given day. I'm wondering if you could just share with us a few of the concerns that really land a bit heavy on your heart.
You know, I have to be honest, my personality is one where I do like to be strategic. I like to have an impact and not feel like I'm wasting a lot of time. This is, you know, an impatience that I have. And I've tried to channel that into a kind of rhythm of work and Sabbath that takes account for the need to have sort of what in nature connection communities is called a mindset of resilience, a mindset of awareness, and so that we have the resources we need when situations arise, so that we can apply them from this grounded place, this grounded focus. So it's hard for me to, the way I would frame it is a little bit differently in terms of concern. I'm really concerned about people feeling burned out and overstretched. I'm really concerned about people feeling overly anxious or burned out by anxiety and by depression. I think that's one reason I wanted to do this work of chaplaincy and coaching, is to help people find a sustainable way to engage with this issue, a way that feels life-giving and not life-draining. So I guess that's how I would frame it. And so the way that the kind of framework that I'm using for the coaching and the chaplaincy involves three kind of sets of engagement. And one of them is, I call it Sabbath, where we really take time to intentionally to connect with nature and to grieve and to rage. And we really make space for that as a high priority. It's just as high a priority as building skills, resilient skills, such as how do we manage without electricity or running water, or how can we make medicines from the plants in our own yard and things like that. And then the third one is political engagement, which is a really important, I mean, there's a lot of directions you can go with that, but it's something that a lot of people aren't that into, to be honest. And it's something that I just really want. It's my first ethics mentor really drove this home with me. His name is Jim Nash. He wrote a book called Loving Nature, which is an amazing book if anybody's read it. And he was just very committed to political engagement. And I remember the times that I've been in other parts of the world, people really see being an engaged citizen as our civic responsibility in a way that a lot of Americans kind of don't. So our voter turnout is like appallingly low. Our awareness of the issues and what we're voting on is also comparatively low. So I really just make that political engagement the third of these three kind of interwoven priorities or concerns, and each of them is equally important, you know, kind of like a stool with three legs. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I think what I'm hearing somewhere in those three legs of the stool is what I might call self-regulation or co-regulation. Like, how do we individually and collectively keep ourselves in a state of being that is as far the other end from being burned out and stressed and overwhelmed as one can be. And I'm wondering if there's anything you might share about that concept, and then assuming that you might have some practices in your own life and in your own family that are helpful in keeping y'all with open hearts and adequate life energy moving to be able to stay engaged. I'm wondering if it sparks you to share anything.
Sure. So my tradition, the Methodist Wesleyan tradition, was founded by the Wesleys, in particular John Wesley, focuses on this idea of responsible grace. And there's a kind of dialectic relationship between grace and responsibility, and they both move us toward holiness. This is the idea in community. And that community, from Wesley's perspective, included the whole creation. And I think for me, the responsibility, I mean, if you get too focused on the politics and it doesn't go the way you were hoping politically, that can really feel like the rug got pulled out from under you in terms of your psychological resilience, your mindset. So also having these other things matters. But the thing is, each of them, if you just focus on that one, can also suck you down, because some people focus only on being out in nature and they don't ever go advocate for justice. And that's a kind of luxury that I think in the end drains us, because we do, it nourishes our soul to be engaged in the work of justice. And the work of skill building and resilient skill building, it builds empowerment too. But again, if you only focus on that and you never allow yourself to grieve and you never, have Sabbath, then you can just become burned out in that way too. So right. I don't want people to be just really in this space of panic and fear and just nose to the grindstone. Obviously, there are moments when we're going to go all out, right? Just we can't sustain that. And so you asked about specific practices that we engage in. And there's a whole lot. Some of them are small kind of daily things. Some of them are more medium sized and some of them are really big. And one of the things that I think we find particularly meaningful in our family is our ancestral traditions. My husband's Korean. And while I was in seminary, I had the opportunity to, actually, even back when I was in biology, I was a biologist, I was always surrounded by Korean people from Korea, which my husband calls real Koreans. And he grew up in Canada. So I learned about a lot of interesting Korean traditions regarding ancestors. And then when I went to seminary, I was able to study with a professor who's spent a lot of time in the US, but is originally from Korea. And so, for example, when Koreans have a special meal, sometimes they set a place for the ancestors. Or at certain times of year, they go and they have a kind of special day when they tend to the graves and they make special foods and offer them to the ancestors, and they bless them and thank them for giving us life.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that a lot of the theology from my tradition made sense suddenly when I started doing that. I felt this incredible sense of love, just completely, what's the word I'm looking for? Just, what's the word when it's like not qualified, just completely, completely loving without any sense of, oh, you have to do this or you have to do that in order to be loved, right?
I get you. Thank you. Yeah.
I can't think of the word now.
I don't know the right word, but I understand what you're pointing at.
Yeah, and grace and pride and just this amazing sense of being held by grace. So I feel really grateful for that diversity of culture being brought into my family and the ways that that has helped my children, because my mother died 10 years ago when my kids were 7 and 4, and she had been living with us, so they were very close to her. And having those ancestral traditions then to fall back on during that very difficult time really was a very healing experience, not just for me, but for my kids. And so I'm very grateful for all of that. And now that we're facing this instability of this climate situation, we have traditions like that we can use. And sometimes my children will just go and sit. We have a kind of ancestor altar in our home, and it has some photos and it has some objects on it. And on special days, sometimes we go, like on their birthday, we might go and sit there. We might bow to our ancestors and then just talk a little. And that was really hard at first after my mom passed away and my grandparents. But now I notice that sometimes they will just go use that altar when they need to, and pour out their grief or their joy and feel it being held. And that's, I think, a really wonderful tradition that I wish more people had access to.
Yeah. Wonderful. Really unusual and wonderful things you're sharing. I appreciate that. And perhaps we can just pepper those in, both of us, during the rest of the conversation. But I first want to loop back and thank you for this term, responsible grace. It's I use the term grace quite a bit in my body of work, and this is the first time I've heard responsible grace, and I absolutely hear the distinction, and it's very potent, really important. And so I thank you for that. That's a new one for me, and I'm promising myself to do some more digging into that and deepening my understanding of what you're sharing. I have another term that I'd like you to share. I'd like to ask you to share whatever variation you might have from your lineage about the word hope. Wondering how that fits into this picture, this path that you and your immediate ancestors, your family have really groomed this path in an extraordinary way. And I'm wondering how that word hope fits in, or does it fit in anywhere in your family and your traditions?
Yeah, it's really important, and something that a lot of people are looking for right now. One of the things that I talk about is what I call a fierce hope. Fierce hope is a hope that's not attached to any particular outcome. It's just doing what you feel is right anyway. And in the Christian tradition, we find the example for that in the choices of Jesus, who chose to go to Jerusalem knowing that he would be put to death. And so he chose, to continue the work that he was doing, which was for the liberation of the poor and marginalized people of Israel. Anyway. And it was a choice of liberation instead of survival. So one of the things I try to work with people on is attachment, to use the Buddhist term. And what are we attached to and how is it causing us suffering? Because if we can identify that and we can try to learn to be non-attached, even to survival, then it can free up a lot of energy for us to do what we need to do. If we're still really attached to something, it's very draining, all that fear and that suffering. So I think that there is a hopefulness in the idea that we're not alone. We're working together with one another and with all of creation. All of these storms are actually the creation healing itself. And we can trust it to do that. I think there's a hopefulness in letting go of the idea that humanity is the most important thing and that humanity must survive this transitional moment. And if we can try to learn non-attachment, try to build that, it can give us a deeper kind of hope for this kind of vision of wholeness and healing that is bigger than you and me. It's not easy, but it's very simple.
Yeah, good. I actually wouldn't have expected anything less than what you just shared. I so appreciate that. And it is no surprise, given what you've been describing as your upbringing and your values and your faith tradition. It seems like a really solid fit.
Well, and it's part of, Jesus is a good example, but he comes from a Jewish tradition, the Jewish prophetic tradition. So it's consistent with all of the Jewish prophetic tradition, and many other religious traditions have similar ideas. It's just that that's my lens. So
I'm curious, again, given the acuity, the incredible sensitivity with which you scan the world and interact with the world, I'm curious if you could share some of what when you look out into the world nowadays, what brings you inspiration? There's plenty in the news every day to discourage us and to, knock us off our place of balance and equanimity. I'm wondering what you see that inspires you out ahead, or in your day.
Honestly, one of my concerns is that we don't feel enough compassion for ourselves. And one of the things I love, again, from my tradition, from the Wesleyan tradition, there's an idea, Jesus is the great physician and the great sort of healer. And we, it's not that people don't use the word sin, but it's really seen as woundedness or brokenness and in something in need of healing. I think that's a very true and compassionate way to engage with the things that we don't understand and that we disagree with and that we find the most difficult. So one of the things that people in my family work on, especially my brother, is trying to understand toxic masculinity and how to heal that. And when we see, what really inspires me is in the moment when somebody is confronted by something that's brokenness in another person, and they're able to see it as woundedness, and they're able to see it as something in need of healing. That doesn't mean we don't set boundaries around it so that it can't harm people. It just means that we're not labeling some people as evil and other people as good, right? And because all of us have moments when we are in that space where we maybe are lashing out and causing harm. And maybe some people cause more harm than others, but we all understand that idea, especially as parents, that we're not infinite resources of patience. Sometimes we're tired or stressed or overwhelmed, and we might not be our best selves. And if we can, when our children act that way, if we can be really compassionate, and then it kind of empowers them to be compassionate back to us when we're not our best selves with them. And that, I just find that whole concept very inspiring. maybe partly because it's really challenging, but
Yeah.
I believe that these things can be learned through practice, these skills.
Again, I'm just getting a sense that you have a tendency to seek out some of the more inspiring and possibly transformative elements in your community and in your studies prior and so on. I'm curious if you might have some recommendations for those of us who haven't had that level of study and that level of faith background and so on. Where might we look, especially those of us who are kind of new to this idea of being collapse aware in our communities? Where could we look to gain some of these skills, some of these self-regulation skills, some of these awareness expanding skills, some of these skills that seem to be implied by the whole notion of, well, how do we come together? How do we come together in our neighborhood, in our community, in our city, in our nation, when everything seems so darn polarized? It can seem so daunting to start any of those things. You know, we're living in a world that can often be seen as a post-truth world, or a world of alternative facts or fake news. And then if I then look at, okay, so if I try to get together with other people, one of the first things that I'll stumble into is just how much division there seems to be, and so much polarity. I would say, just if you wouldn't mind just picking any of those topics, and do you have any suggestions for where someone kind of new to that topic could start to flex some new muscles and learn some important new skills?
It's an interesting. So, I mean, I have some thoughts of practices, but I also have actual, like, kind of book resources.
Yeah.
Were
Oh,
you looking
absolutely.
for both?
Beautiful.
Okay. Well, I have to say, we moved into this neighborhood about 2.5 years ago. And apparently 30 years ago, a couple of parents in the neighborhood started a play group. And the parents, the mothers of the play group, started to meet once a month to have a kind of dinner together, like a potluck. And then other people in the neighborhood found out, other women, and said, hey, I want to be a part of that. So now for 33 years, the women in my neighborhood, about 30 of them, not all of them come every month, but throughout the year, they have a monthly dinner. And it can be potluck, it can be you make the food, it can be whatever you want it to be. But the point is just to get together and have fun. And the truth is, it's a diverse neighborhood. There's ethnic diversity, there's socioeconomic diversity, and there's political diversity. But people kind of get together and they just relax and have fun. And they don't debate and argue in ways that are, upsetting for people. And I think that every neighborhood should have that, and it doesn't have to be just the women. It would be nice if there were other things happening too, but having it start there, to me, seems like a really wonderful opportunity. So that, when I got this book recently called Retro Suburbia, and it's by David Holmgren, who's a permaculturist in Australia, and it's about retrofitting the suburbs to become a resilient network of integrated homesteads in terms of building climate resilience. And now, after a few years of getting to know these people, I can say, hey, does anybody want to read this book with me? And we can talk about how to make our suburb a network of integrated homesteads to build climate resilience. And people can say, oh yeah, maybe that sounds interesting. I'd like to do that. And the 2 people in my neighborhood have chickens, and one person weaves cloth. And so there's, an interesting kind of possibility there. So I do think that building community is a really important aspect of it, and it's hard to know sometimes how to begin. So I find that example to be easy,
Yeah.
pretty easy and hopeful one.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, having it be the women does make it feel different from if it were everybody. So it would be important to have other opportunities too. So sometimes if somebody, like their kid graduates, then they'll have a party and they'll light the whole neighborhood. Anyway,
Yeah.
disconnection is a challenge, and this new neighborhood has figured out a way to be connected, and that's safer, and it's also an opportunity for a lot more resilience.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you.
Collapse resilience. Yeah, and the grief is a tricky one. I think that we really do need, as a culture, to re-embrace the concept of grief and rage. And because if we don't make spaces to grieve and rage, then it spills out where we don't want it to.
Yes.
We all kind of know this academically, but it takes great courage. It's something I remember several years ago, just deciding that whenever I needed to cry, I was going to cry, even if I was in public. And that was very hard for me. I didn't want to do that, but I realized that if I don't do that, I get migraine headaches. But I also realized that it was really good modeling for my kids. And so, I started kind of telling them when they would get upset, I would say, I'm proud of you for feeling your feelings. It takes courage to feel your feelings.
Yeah.
Just let it out. We have this tendency to want to comfort each other into not grieving, right? Instead of just being there, being a kind of non-anxious presence to somebody else's grief.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's a mistake that a lot of parents make. I have a friend who wrote a book called Tears Heal. It's based on this premise. Her name is Kate Orson. And I've read several other things way back in seminary for people who are interested in Judeo-Christian resources. I read a book called Rachel's Cry. The subtitle is something like Prayer of Lament and Rebirth of Hope. Anyway, it's a book called Rachel's Cry. And it's about lament in the Hebrew Bible and how important lament is, and how we as religious communities need to create more space for lament with one another. It's really inspiring. It kind of helped me, 16, 17 years ago, to understand, wow, this is true. This is something that's very important. And we have a lot of opportunities for doing that we're not taking advantage of. One of my sisters does a lot of work with nature connection, and she helps lead grief rituals along the lines of Sobanfu Some.
Yeah.
You've heard of her. So those grief rituals can be very healing for people too. And that's a resource that I recommend. So that's the grieving piece.
Yeah.
And I think people need, most of all, just to give themselves permission. I think that's the biggest thing, is just to realize that if we don't let it out, then it causes sickness in us and in our relationships. So it's scary to let it out, but it's what we need to do. And we kind of need to mama up, and do that.
Great. Yeah, I also lead that type of grief ritual, and just find it so life-giving. It's such a joy. And it's so hard to explain to someone who's been raised in the tradition, what seems to be the American tradition, of avoiding death, avoiding grief, avoiding pain. And, it's just sometimes a bit challenging to translate for someone who's been grown up in that way, to then consider the possibility that leaning into those things in life can be so deeply nourishing.
Yeah, it's, I think only certain people will actually have the courage to go to that kind of grief ritual.
Yeah.
So it takes, enormous amount of courage. And if you've your whole life not been expressing grief, then there's a lot of grief stored in you.
Yeah.
I actually like your expression, turning toward. One of the other resources that I have found very helpful is a book called The Mindful Way Through Depression. Are you familiar with this book? One
Yeah.
of the 4 authors is John Kabat-Zinn. He's pretty famous for some of his mindfulness stuff, but it's by 4 different authors. And I'm a trauma survivor, and I have other trauma survivors in my family. And one of the things I like about this book is that they say, you know, when you do this body scan and you figure out where you're feeling off, you don't have to turn right toward the middle of it. You can just turn toward the very, very edge of it. The idea that you're turning toward it at all is what matters.
Yeah.
And so for people who are processing a lot of grief or trauma, that's a gentle way. And that's why I say, I think, you know, we need to make space for this in a lot of ways. And getting all together for a grief ritual is incredible. It's just that only certain people are going to go.
Yes.
So how else can we do that in the everyday and in the every week is something that I'm toying with. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities. It's just a matter of looking for them and making it happen.
And crafting them. Yeah, that's beautiful. Would you say the name of the book again?
I think it's The Mindful Way Through Depression. I'm pretty sure. It might be but I think it's the. That's the part I can't remember.
Okay.
But I do recommend the book highly. And
Great.
we have a lot of anxiety and depression associated with climate crisis. And so I think this book is an incredible resource to address that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what a lovely set of responses that you've been offering from, you know, the simplest of practices. It's really just what you said. It ranges from these simple daily practices that we might do to things that, you know, the monthly get together, which I can't imagine anything more encouraging of community than getting together to eat and share and laugh and maybe nudge into something of substance. And it sounds like it would have a chance to grow substantially. Give it a few years, and it sounds like more than 30 years. It's grown plenty.
Well, you know, I also am a big fan of book groups. A friend of mine started one several years ago because there were parenting books she wanted to read. And I was like, great, let's do it. And it forced me to read several parenting books I'd been meaning to read and hadn't read. So last year, I started a book group of basically progressive Christianity books by Marcus Borg that I wanted to read. And it's still going because everybody loves it so much. It's been, I don't know, almost been about a year now. I think they're a great opportunity. And I just want to say, in terms of parenting, one of those books, which is called Parent Effectiveness Training. Have you heard of that one?
Oh,
it's
yeah.
old.
Classic.
It's an old one, but they keep revising it, PET. And I just think, you know, if I ever have to name one book, that's the one I name, because I think it's a really good, probably very applicable to all of these things about collapse.
Wow. I didn't
read it with that in mind, though. I'll admit I read it a long time ago.
I appreciate that. That's the first time I've heard someone suggest that in this series, and it makes sense. It's been so long since I've touched that book or even thought of it. So thank you for that reminder.
I mean, it's basically about reflective listening. And reflective listening is a skill that a lot of people don't have and don't know about. And as a parent, I think it's an invaluable tool for connecting with your kid, building a mutual trust relationship, mutual respect relationship.
Yeah.
And my kids, they've really needed to let out a lot of anger and bitterness about this situation that's been handed to them.
Yes.
And so.
Well, I can feel the envelope of our time together is coming to a close, and it's so rich. And you have been so generous to share not only those practices, but these abundant resources, these book suggestions, and so on. And I'm wondering if there's a way that, if you could imagine someone fairly new to the facing into the future that we appear to be committed to at this point, and knowing what you know and how long you've been exposed to a remarkably empowering path I'm wondering if you would have anything to share for someone who's new.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't had those years and years of just the natural sharing and development of that as you've been describing it in your own family. Is there anything that you might suggest or offer or share for that new person as they start on their path in this remarkable time in human history?
It's an interesting question. And I don't think I saw that one in advance, so I'm doing this one off the cuff.
Yeah, good.
First of all, I just want to say that I was in a training for faith-based ocean leadership. And one of the things that was presented was a recent research paper about how people tend to engage with issues within one of 6 different frames. And so if you can figure out which of the 6 frames you're resonating with, it can help you find your avenue into it. And I can't tick off the 6 frames off the top of my head, but one of them is, they were using the idea of the ocean as their example. And for some people, it's just that when they're with the ocean, they feel like they can breathe and meditate, and they really resonate with it as, this source of energy. Whereas other people, it's like, well, I went fishing with my grandparents, and so I want to be able to go fishing with my grandchildren, and so I care about the ocean from this sort of traditional American values kind of frame. And there's 6 different ones. And so I think for somebody starting out, I would try to figure out which of those really resonates with you. And that's the direction toward what you're trying to do. And so without knowing that, it's a little bit hard to know which way to point people. Some people really find it in their faith tradition or in their cultural heritage. For me, I've got several different cultures, but my grandfather on my dad's side came from Cornwall, and Cornwall is one of the 6 Celtic nations, and there's a lot of nature-based Christianity and nature-based philosophy there that's really beautiful. So my grandfather was a Methodist pastor, but when you asked him, what's your religion, he would say he was a Druid. And that was just, in the 50s, it's a while ago. Yeah. And so I think that people find their points of connection. And the one thing that I tell people really, and this is probably the answer that I was driving at to this question, is find the things that you already really love and care about, and just find the connections between those things and the climate or eco-justice, because those connections do exist. It's really just a matter of figuring out what they are. That was what we were doing with ecology. So what's the thing that you love or care about the most? Or what are the few things that you spend your time on? Even if it's stray dogs, right? It doesn't matter. Quilting, it doesn't matter what it is. Whatever it is, there are connections. And if you can integrate that and piggyback it onto what you're already invested in, then it's going to feel very liberating and life-giving to you, and not feel like a chore or a grind or one more thing to add on to your life. Sometimes it's parenting. You just love spending time with your kids. Okay, well, let's go see what the hikes are. Let's go to All Trails and see what the hikes are in our area and just take one. Or there's actually a lot of free programming available for this kind of thing in a lot of areas that people don't realize. So maybe you like spending time with certain people. Can you make that time that you spend include something about this, right? Yeah. So anyway, that's probably my biggest piece of advice. And you don't want to just add one more thing where like I said, my concern, we're overburdened, we're overstretched, we're overwhelmed.
Yeah. Just one last piece about the 6 frames that you mentioned. Is there any other keyword I might include as I go to research that and include it in the show notes for today?
If you're going to have notes, I can just look it up and send it to you. I just don't have it off the top of my head.
Wonderful.
I can't, because they didn't give us the author of the study at the time. And so I asked if they would send it to us afterwards, because like you, I was interested in the study
Yeah,
itself.
yeah, that's great.
It's good to know, right?
Yes, it is. It is. Well, Tallessyn, it's just been a joy, and I feel like I've learned so much, and obviously barely scratched the surface of what's possible in conversation with you. But I just thank you for contributing to this project of inviting conversations in collapse-aware parents, and it's been remarkable to touch in with someone who's had this much empowerment and almost custom designed empowerment for these times. It's quite a remarkable story you tell, and really been a pleasure. And I think the community that you're in is obviously very, very lucky to have you.
Well, I want to thank you, Dean. It's really enjoyable to talk with you, and hopeful for me to meet other people that are so dedicated. So I'm grateful to you for all this work that you're doing. And I'm also just grateful for your words of affirmation. I mean, it took me a while in my journey to figure out exactly where I felt like I was called to work.
Yeah.
And so it feels wonderful to feel like that is resonating with people. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, beautiful. And it looks like we might have the opportunity to speak with at least one of your daughters as well.
Yep. Telynia will be home in a while, so
all right.
It'll be her turn. Thank you for welcoming her as well.
It'll be good to have these two interviews right up next to each other in the parenting series as it lives on the website. So again, my warmest thanks to you, and look forward very much to connecting with your daughter in just a little while. And please have a wonderful holiday time. And I look forward to the next time that you and I get a chance to have more conversation as well.
Me too. Thank you again, Dean.
All righty. Bye.
Bye.
Another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.